Everything you thought you knew about dopamine is wrong. It's not a pleasure chemical. No, you're not addicted to it. And no, social media is not flooding your brain with it. So what is dopamine? Dopamine is a chemical that we make in our brain, and it's used in the reward process throughout our body. It is meant to motivate us for survival in a life that is hard. Keyword on hard. I learned this from a recent podcast, Diary of a CEO, and he had a guest on there, Dr. Anna Lembke. Dr. Anna Lembke is a professor at Stanford, I believe, and she studies everything dopamine. And she broke down at least 5 myths floating out there about dopamine, including this first one. Dopamine is a pleasure chemical. Dopamine is not a pleasure chemical. It's associated with pleasure, but its importance serves a much more vital part in all of our lives. Take a look.
What activities that I do every day have an impact on my dopamine?
Well, probably almost everything, in some ways. Every time we are doing something that's pleasurable, reinforcing, rewarding, that will affect dopamine. It's really the primary signal that lets us know that this thing is potentially important for our survival, as I mentioned. But even aversive stimuli can trigger dopamine.
What's aversive mean?
Something that's painful or not pleasurable. Dopamine gets involved in that equation. Anything that's novel or new is something that triggers our dopamine in our reward pathway. Dopamine is fundamental for movement, so not just pleasure and reward, but also movement. So, for example, Parkinson's disease, which is a disease related to stiffness and tremor, is caused by a depletion of dopamine in a part of the brain called the substantia nigra. And as dopamine gets depleted in that part of the brain, people lose the ability to move their bodies. And it's probably no coincidence that the same neurotransmitter that is so important for pleasure, reward, motivation is also really important for movement, because most organisms have to locomote toward the object of their desire. If we want that thing, we have to exert effort, right? We have to put in the work to go get it. But in the world today, we really don't have to do that, right? We can swipe right, we can swipe left, and all of a sudden it magically appears at the touch of a finger. And that's very confusing for our brains, because that's not how we evolved. We really evolved for having to do quite a bit of upfront work for a tiny little bit of reward.
So dopamine is a motivator, but what happens when you remove dopamine from the brain? Well, Dr. Anna Lembke tells us about a study that was done and performed on rats, and it debunks myth number 4. Dopamine is only released when you achieve something. That's not true. Take a look.
So, for example, there's a very famous experiment in which rats were engineered to have no dopamine in the brain's reward pathway. And the scientists discovered that if they put food in the rat's mouth, the rat would eat the food, would seem to get some pleasure from the food, if you can determine that from watching a rat eat, which I think they felt like they could. But if you put the food even a body length away, the rat will starve to death. The idea being that without dopamine, we're not motivated to seek out the things that we need for our basic survival.
So that study is crazy. With food only just a foot away from his mouth, the rat didn't eat. It starved to death. And I don't know if you ever had any experiences with rats, but I have. And that's not very rat-like. Rats just don't not eat. As a matter of fact, I would say that rats put in a lot of effort to eat. They chew through some of everything. Yeah, that's not very rat-like at all. So we know that dopamine is a motivator to keep doing something that our brains perceive to be good. There's a couple of problems with that. Our brains perceiving things that aren't good for us to be good for us, but we could touch on that later. And also, our brains are trying to reach what's called homeostasis, which is this kind of even baseline balance inside of our brain. And this kind of debunks myth number 3. More dopamine equals more happiness. That's not true. In the short time, that might feel good, but eventually you're going to feel absolutely terrible. Just think of when you drink a whole lot and then you have that hangover in the morning. Well, there's a reason behind that.
Now, another important concept here is what we call drug of choice, which is to say what releases a lot of dopamine in your brain may not release a lot of dopamine in my brain and vice versa, right? Which is this idea that people have predilections to different kinds of drugs. And by the way, people can get addicted to behaviors too. I should emphasize that.
When you say drug of choice, you mean the brain has a particular sensitivity to that drug in terms of dopamine?
Yes.
Okay.
The more dopamine that's released, the faster that it's released, the more likely that drug is to be addictive for a given individual.
So you're holding some whiskey there.
I'm holding some whiskey.
There could be a brain that is very sensitive to whiskey, and there could be a different brain that you could pour all the whiskey in you like, and the dopamine response is sort of limited.
Exactly.
Okay.
And for many of my patients who become addicted to alcohol, they will tell you that from the first moment they had alcohol, they knew they were either in trouble or had met their best friend or some combination. It was a very potent experience for them. All right, so let's go ahead and put this on the pleasure side of the balance. Dopamine's being released, but no sooner has that happened than my brain will work very hard to restore a level balance. And by the way, a level balance is what neuroscientists call homeostasis, okay? And one of the overarching physiologic drives for all living organisms is to return to homeostasis. Homeostasis is that parameter of what's often called affordances, or states of being that are adaptive and healthy for the organism. For example, like we have a certain homeostasis of body temperature, and if we go much beyond that, either too high or too low, we will disintegrate and die, right? So homeostasis is that states of being that are compatible with existence and potentially advantageous too.
Sort of baseline level.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah,
balance.
Baseline level. And by the way, we're always releasing dopamine at a kind of tonic baseline level in our brains. I sometimes think of it as the heartbeat of the brain.
So what's happened here for people that can't see is you poured a little bit of whiskey into one end of the scale, the pleasure side of the scale, and the other side of the scale has risen because now there's whiskey in the pleasure side, which I guess has released dopamine.
Exactly. So now we've released dopamine in the reward pathway. Okay.
Because the pain side went up, does that mean there's now less pain in the brain?
Well, I think, again, this is a metaphor.
Sure.
It's an oversimplification. The idea here is just when we press on the pleasure side, we're releasing dopamine in the reward pathway and experiencing pleasure. Okay. But no sooner has that happened than our brain will try to compensate or adapt to increase dopamine firing by downregulating dopamine transmission, for example, by involuting postsynaptic dopamine receptors.
What does that mean?
Okay. So our brain is a bunch of wires, that conduct these electrical signals. And these long spindly cells are called neurons. And the thing about neurons is that they don't actually touch end to end. There's a little gap or space between them, and that gap is called the synapse. Mm-hmm. And that gap or synapse is bridged by what we call neurotransmitters. And dopamine is one of those neurotransmitters, okay? Mm-hmm. And when the presynaptic neuron pulses and releases dopamine, it crosses the synapse and binds to a receptor on the postsynaptic neuron, which either continues or aborts that electrical signal. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the ways that our brain can decrease the effects of dopamine, decrease dopamine transmission, is by involuting or taking inside the neuron the postsynaptic receptor. That way, when dopamine is released, it has nowhere to bind.
Oh, okay. So it's like removing the docking station.
Exactly.
Okay.
Very good. It's removing the docking station. So essentially, getting back to our scale, we've ingested alcohol, we've increased dopamine firing in the reward pathway. But remember, our pleasure-pain balance wants to return to a level position, level with the ground, homeostasis. So it's going to decrease dopamine transmission by, for example, involuting those postsynaptic dopamine receptors. But one thing about the brain in its process of trying to get back to homeostasis, and again, I like to think of this neuroadaptation process as these gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. You don't have gremlins here. You have these little rocks. But let's go ahead and put a rock on the pain side of the balance. And these rocks are friends, right? Their job is to level the balance. Because remember, we got to go back to homeostasis. So I'm going to put a rock on, and you're going to see, oh my gosh, it overshot, right? Now I've got it pressed down on the pain side of the balance. But that's exactly what happens in our brains. In this process of neuroadaptation, those gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance don't get off as soon as the balance is level. They stay on until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount.
So is that what a hangover is, or a come down, as they would say when people take drugs, they say, I have a come down?
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. That's the hangover, the come down, the blue Monday, or on a much smaller scale, just that moment of craving, right? That moment of wanting to have one more shot, right?
Why does it overshoot? Why can't it just perfectly hit homeostasis?
Such a great question.
Because then we'd feel fine.
Yeah. Why did Mother Nature do that to us? So cruel, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to tell you an evolutionary just so story. What we mean by that is we don't really know why, this mechanism exists, but from an evolutionary perspective, if you're living in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, this is the perfect mechanism to make sure that we're never satisfied with what we have, that we're always wanting more. It's made us the ultimate seekers.
Hundreds of years ago, Native Americans hunted large bison and buffalo without guns, just spears and arrows. And I don't know if you've seen one of these bison or buffalo up close, but just one shot from a bow and arrow is not bringing it down. So why would the Native Americans go after such large animals? I'm sure that there were much easier prey to go after. Well, it was dopamine. Dopamine surging throughout their brains and their body told them that although very difficult, it was worth the danger. Although very difficult, this massive animal was going to be more than just food. It was going to be clothing for their whole tribe. One successful hunt like that would feed and clothe a tribe for days, maybe even weeks. They were motivated beyond difficulty. They were motivated beyond danger. This is what dopamine does. They put up that upfront effort, that difficulty to get the longer lasting reward. And this is how life should be lived. This is how life was meant to be lived. Our brains are still stuck during the time where we had to hunt for our food. Now we don't have to. Times have changed, but our brains have not adapted at all.
Is it impossible to live in a perfect homeostasis balance in the world we live in?
Right. Even more than having to try to live within this sort of narrow range of homeostasis, in the world we live in today, we probably have to intentionally do things that are painful, do things that are hard. Pleasure-pain balance, like we learned that when we press on the pleasure side of the balance, like with alcohol or pornography or romance novels or cannabis or whatever it is, right? No sooner does that happen than our brain adapts by those neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again, but they like it on the balance, so they don't get off right when it's level. They stay on until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the come down, the hangover, etc. But it turns out the opposite is also true. If we intentionally press on the pain side of the balance, for example, with exercise or an ice-cold water bath or intermittent fasting, those gremlins will hop on the pleasure side of the balance, and we will get our dopamine indirectly by paying for it up front. And there are studies in humans showing that when humans expose themselves to exercise, for example, dopamine levels gradually rise over the latter half of the exercise. And then when the exercise stops, dopamine levels will remain elevated for hours afterwards before going back down to the baseline level position without ever going into that dopamine deficit state. So it's a great way to get our dopamine in directly because it's much less vulnerable to that compulsive craving phenomenon of overuse.
So there's a myth floating out there that we can be addicted to dopamine. We're not addicted to dopamine. We're addicted to the things that give us this high volume release of dopamine. That's what we're addicted to.
What are the biggest misconceptions you've come across?
The main misconception is that somehow we can get addicted to dopamine. We're not getting addicted to dopamine itself. Dopamine is neither good nor bad. It's a signal to tell us whether or not something that we're doing is potentially useful for our survival. And also, it's related to what we predicted about how rewarding or pleasurable something would be. And so it's really, I sometimes I joke, it's like the reward theory of relativity, dopamine is, in the sense that pleasure and pain really are truly relative to one another. And so dopamine gives us information about where we are in that relativity scale between pleasure and pain.
Dopamine triggering things are so easily accessible. We can go buy sugar, rolled up in sugar, sprinkled with a little bit more sugar on top of it. And then we can have some weed delivered to us. We can smoke that weed and eat our sugar, rolled up in sugar, sprinkled with a little bit more sugar on top of it, right? Let's not get into the drugs that Big Pharma is producing, right? Those are the big heavy hitters. And people are getting addicted to these things. And for the sake of, okay, it's legal and okay, it takes away the pain, or okay, I feel good in the moment, right? And so we are addicted to these things, not actual dopamine. And each of us are different. All of us are different. Me is novelty, right? I have to watch it because I love traveling. I love experiencing new cultures, and I love tech. And the newness within these things, the newness of travel, the newness of cultures, and the newness of tech, just I can get addicted to it and spend a lot of money doing it as well. And so we all have things that we have to watch out for. I don't have a problem with eating healthy. I don't expect food to taste good all the time. So that's not my thing. But I can remember, I can see how it is a challenge for a lot of people. Food tastes good. And the best tasting food is cheap. I get it. It's not cheap to eat healthy. It's not even convenient at all to eat healthy. The amount of juicing and smoothies that I have to make, that's not convenient. It's a lot of work put into having to eat healthy, especially within our society where we have so many things that can release or trigger these high volume releases of dopamine within our brain. And it's just not good for us. Easy is the enemy all day long. We need to choose discipline over motivation. Discipline over motivation all day, because motivation is connected to dopamine. Dopamine, motivation is about how we feel in the moment. And we already know that dopamine goes, it's like the Dow Jones, it goes up and down, and it's like the stock market. It's not reliable. And so we choose absolute discipline over that. Discipline says, I'm gonna get my ass up and work out at 5 a.m. I don't fucking feel like it, but I'm going to get my ass up and I'm going to go work out. It's no choice. It doesn't matter what time I went to bed. It doesn't matter how I feel. It doesn't matter if I'm hungry. It doesn't matter if I'm tired at all. You just don't feel like it at all. Motivation says, oh yeah, you pumped one day to get up and go work out, but you're wondering why you fell off. You fell off because you're relying on your motivation. You know, that song that wakes you up in the morning. Yeah, it was good the first few times, but if you're honest, you're getting kind of tired of it, right? It's the same thing with Christmas presents. When you open up that Christmas gift, it was the best Christmas gift that you had ever had in your whole life, and 1 month later, you're not playing with it. The kid's not playing with it. You don't wear that watch. You don't even care about it. But it was the best thing in that moment, right? And so all these things are connected to dopamine. So what do? Do we just sit back and become victims to our own devices? That's how this last myth was created. And although with good intentions, it needs a little bit more clarification. But before I reveal the number one myth about dopamine, if this information was helpful for you in any kind of way, please like and subscribe. And it would give me a little bit of dopamine release if you did that as well. Get what I did there? Dopamine release. It actually does. It's true though. It would. Anyways, all right. The number one myth about dopamine is that dopamine fasting resets your dopamine levels. You don't fast from dopamine, but the unhealthy activities that give you those high volume releases from dopamine, that's what you fast from.
Well, I mean, I guess I would emphasize that when I talk about the dopamine fasting, it's an early intervention. It's not an intervention that I would recommend for someone who had repeatedly tried to quit on their own and been unable to. Clearly that would be an exercise in futility. That person should go and get professional help. Maybe they need to go to a residential treatment center. I also wouldn't recommend dopamine fasting or just quitting your drug of choice if you're at risk for a life-threatening withdrawal. So we can have life-threatening withdrawal from alcohol and benzodiazepines like Klonopin, Xanax, Ativan. Again, in those cases, go see a professional, get help with a medical detoxification before you try to, sustain abstinence for a period of time. So, I would blanket the whole thing with like the caveat, go see your addiction, go see the addiction medicine specialist near you.
Let's separate fact from fiction together. And remember, trust the experts, the researchers, the ones dedicating their lives to science, and ignore the noise. Until next time, stay curious.